I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Dave Laird.
And I'm Krzys Piekarski, and you're listening as the world turns. How was that, fellas?
That's good.
All right.
Yeah, that's right on.
Good Pale King reference.
Yes. Nice. Well, welcome everybody to, this is episode 15 of The Great Concavity, and we are joined, as you heard, by our friend Krzys. So you guys are just hanging out actually together in Matt's living room in Austin right now. So it's kind of like a local recording this time.
That's right. This is a first for us where we've got an in-person interview. I'm here with Krzys Piekarski, as I mentioned, and he is local to Austin. And he got a PhD from the University of Texas in Austin here and wrote his dissertation on Buddhism and David Foster Wallace.
Yes.
So I've known Krzys for a while. I would say 2010, 2011, somewhere in there.
And I've been trying to come over to your house.
It's first time to my house.
It took me 6 years, but I was hanging out outside your windows at night.
It's kind of a joke because I live pretty far north in Austin, so it's a long trip.
Oh yeah, a bit of a haul.
From central or south Austin.
Yeah.
It's a very spread out town, but Krzys and I have hung out around campus many times and around several
Ransom Center events,
watering holes around town. And Krzys also leads a local reading group here on Moby Dick.
Oh, cool.
So maybe we can talk about Moby Dick later.
I have not read Moby Dick, to my great literary shame.
Well, that's fine. We're actually not going to talk about Moby Dick tonight.
Other big books, perhaps.
Yeah, some other big books. So, anyways, Krzys, anything else that I left out about your introduction here?
Nope.
Are you a teacher, Krzys? Do you teach at a local college or university?
I did.
Yeah,
so cool. my path was my education path was I started to Teach for America right after college, and then I did grad school at UT. Then I left and taught at a boarding school in Vermont called the Putney School.
Oh yeah.
Great little school on top of a hill in beautiful Vermont.
Oh, cool.
And then I went over to the other side of the country in Washington.
Oh yeah.
Where I taught at Whitman College while finishing up the dissertation. And then after that was done, I taught in prison for the state penitentiary for a little bit over a year.
Wow, that's amazing.
Some college courses. And so I actually taught some Asian philosophy classes there.
Oh, cool.
Introduced some of the fellas to our man.
The main man, DF Dubs.
Yeah. They had a little time on their hands, and
yeah. Did you get them to read Infinite Jest with that time?
I mean, I didn't read it with them.
Yeah.
But they were some of my best students that I've had on any level. And then I found my way back to Austin by teaching at St. Edward's University, and then I threw in I handed in my papers in January to try to start my own Wisdom Academy.
Whoa.
Called the Wisdom Smithy.
Cool. That's radical.
And you also taught at another college here in Austin.
I did?
St. Edward's?
Oh, yeah, St. Edward's. I thought I mentioned that.
Oh, okay, you did mention that.
Yeah.
Nice.
So I was really intrigued when I first met Krzys because I felt like there was such a big interest in David Foster Wallace, in Buddhism, or even really just religion and spirituality.
Yeah.
And at the time, there was really not much out there. And so Krzys was sort of flying blind by trying to analyze this really a whole body of work.
Yeah.
And his dissertation did a pretty damn good job of attacking a whole bit of literature.
Yeah, no kidding.
And what I really like about his dissertation, and I should say, like, his dissertation is available on all the major dissertation services and stuff.
Oh yeah.
I think it's even simpler than that. If you Google my name and David Foster Wallace, I think it shows up as a depository PDF that you can find.
Awesome.
What's the title of it exactly?
It's let me see if I remember. Buddhist philosophy and the work of David Foster Wallace.
Yeah.
Okay, and we'll put a link to it on our website
Yeah, totally.
when this episode goes out. But in that, what I was really impressed with is that you tackle almost all of his work.
Totally.
And that,
it's huge.
And that you go from, a lot of people think, oh, well, he does a couple things that, resonate with Buddhism, but I don't think people would think to go to Girl with Curious Hair and Broom in the System. Infinite Jest and Pale King have, because they're so huge, they have some sort of natural alignment there. But
well, I think so. My dissertation has one huge problem, which is actually it has multiple huge problems. But let me just start with the most obvious. And when you're doing this large overview, you can't avoid the cherry picking problem.
Sure.
I was looking through a Buddhist lens, so anytime I saw Buddhist-like things, I'm like, aha.
Yeah, totally.
I knew I was on to something.
Yeah. I'm having the same experience with my thesis as well.
But that's not the smart way to do it, right? I mean, that's not, let me rephrase that. That's not the critically complex and analytical way to do it. That's just a sort of rough draft. I mean, all dissertations end up being rough drafts anyway, so...
Well, and I didn't mean to imply that you did everything. You didn't do every book of his and force this lens on it. You were uncovering areas of, resonance that might not occur to casual readers who didn't really have the sort of background in Buddhism that you had.
Yeah, exactly. And so what my project ended up, I think, being was a kind of evolution of Wallace as a... My question was really, can Wallace realistically be considered a Buddhist thinker, whether consciously or subconsciously or somewhere in between?
Yeah.
And very early on, even with Girl with Curious Hair, I discovered that as an undergrad, his mentor is a leading Buddhist scholar. And so the implication for me was no matter what, he was thinking about language and he was thinking about linguistics, but you can't your advisor you can't have conversations with your advisor in an office who's a main Buddhist scholar and somehow have that not come up, right? So that was just a little bit of detective work that made me feel like, I'm standing on some kind of ground to suggest that he was starting off on one end, very concerned with a kind of normal, intellectual, linguistic, smarty pants kind of view, and then slowly, as Buddhism itself is about, it's kind of dropping some concepts and move a little bit closer to that preconceptual world. Yeah. Which I think that's what I sort of found in Wallace's work.
Right. But was that your impetus for doing it? Is that the first time you thought, like, okay, this would work, or he really was a Buddhist writer? Or what was the thing where you first read with him where you're like, oh yeah, this guy is a Buddhist writer?
Well, that's a complicated question because I read Wallace way before Buddhism entered my life. So Buddhism didn't show up until I was about 30 years old. And it just so happened that one of my graduate school professors is has studied Buddhism for 45 years and is now an official Dharma heir. Okay. Which is it's a kind of we don't have many of those.
It's like a black belt, right? Like a
Well, and Buddhism in the U.S. is a new thing, really.
Yeah, totally.
Like 45, 50 years.
Yeah, it's not long at all. Yeah. So you don't have that many people that have the official title, and it so happened that my grad school professor was one of these.
Cool.
And so when I sort of stumbled on Buddhist thought as a 30-year-old, I very conveniently was taking a class with a Zen Buddhist.
Oh yeah.
So, but that's already after I had been reading Wallace for 12 years.
Right. Okay.
I found him in as a senior in high school.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Cool.
So I had no conception of any of that. But then backtracking, I was like, wait a second, this Buddhist. Basically, my other scholarly work is on Pynchon.
Oh
so the only thing I've officially published other than Wallace is Pynchon. And that stuff and Wallace's stuff, I was like, there's something about these guys that really resonates that's similar. It's something. And then when I went off into my Buddhism studies, I was like, holy shit, this like
there's a lot of confluence. There's a lot of dialogue here between what Wallace is saying and what this philosophy says. Pretty
much. Yeah. And the fantastic thing I think about exploring it from Wallace's end was that he didn't know it.
It was just kind
until later, right? Until later, but and in a lot of ways, I mean, that's the most brilliant kind of Buddhist you could be.
Stumbling into it, kind of like unconsciously.
Or just not claiming to be Buddhist.
Exactly, right? Because you have to be conscious. You have to be somewhat conscious.
Well, he's on a similar path, I would say.
Yeah.
And then, it just happens to align very closely with a lot of the projects that he's working on aesthetically. Yeah. And, it's interesting as you talked about his undergrad years at Amherst, and he is writing this undergrad dissertation or this thesis that becomes Room of the System, and there's a lot in there about him sort of thumbing his nose at his father by using this analytical philosophy in Wittgenstein, and there's a lot of Wittgenstein in Room of the System, and you sort of latch onto that in your dissertation and was able to and I don't think people would even connect Wittgenstein with a Buddhist philosophy, but can you talk on that for a second?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you use the Google machine and type in Wittgenstein and Zen, you're going to get a lot of hits.
Wow.
A lot of hits. And I wasn't trained formally in Western philosophy, but after discovering Buddhism, there's one go-to guy immediately, and that is Wittgenstein, because I mean, it's difficult to whittle down Buddhism to simple phrases, but it is, to some large extent, there's a famous parable that maybe will seem Wittgensteinian to you, which is, the great Zen master is standing in front of his lecture hall, and then he says, as soon as I open my mouth, I'm already wrong. And that kind of captures, in a sense, the essence of a particular form of Buddhism,
right?
Which is
it's kind of like a koan, sounds like.
No, I don't know. Koans are meant to sort of destabilize all logical ways of thinking, but I think this Buddhist master was saying, our worlds, the reason we go wrong is because we conceptualize things, and we forget that something that is conceptualized is not the same thing as the thing itself. I mean, it's a very, I think, fairly basic concept.
Yeah.
But Wittgenstein, that's, his limits of what is knowable, what is sayable, has to do with conceptions of language. And so there's a lot of really smart papers arguing for Wittgenstein as a Zen Buddhist.
Right.
And against, there's a lot of squabbles, a lot of...
Well, because Wittgenstein is not one thing. I mean, he's got this earlier philosophy that's the Tractatus, that's, the world is everything that is the case, and then he's got this way more confounding later philosophy in the philosophical investigations that's way more harder to summarize, even what he's sort of undoing a lot of his earlier work. So I think, yes, it's easier to say, he fits more with a Hegelian tradition, and it's some of it does, some of it doesn't, and that's also, it seems very Buddhist in itself, and it's maybe not, and some of it is, but it's very this interest in language and this interest in what are the limits of knowledge, and it does seem very likely that someone who's interested in that would also, like Wallace, is also interested in these, what ends up being the Four Noble Truths.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, limits of language, right?
Yeah.
Right, that when we talk, we're already somehow mistaken.
There's error. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we just pause for a second? You give us Buddhism 101. What is Zen Buddhism? What is the Four Noble Truths? I feel I don't want to assume that I'm even on the same plane of what we're talking about right now. But.
Yeah. Well, Wallace mentions the Four Noble Truths in passing in This Is Water speech. This Is Water speech.
Yeah.
You know how I'll answer that question?
How?
one of the things I think you first notice about Wallace is that he's really deeply concerned with anguish.
Human suffering. Yeah,
anguish. I mean, I don't know if someone actually, if we were to do a mathematical percent
of Wallace's work that deals with suffering,
like
very high.
Very high, right?
I think you said in your dissertation you have a line that says infinite jest is like an encyclopedia of suffering.
Yeah, I actually just read that. Yeah, I came across that.
It's a great line. It's a great line.
So like in the McCaffrey interview, when he says that good fiction is, or good art is, 51% pain and 49% pleasure, his ratio is way way higher than that, right? Like 96% pain, 4% pleasure, or something.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, Matt, the historical guy, his main Buddha, his concern was trying to find a way out of this box of suffering that we're born into. And that's the nutshell. I mean, that's the nutshell. We suffer, but do we really have to? Is there a way out? And it gets incredibly tricky right after that, because then what do we mean by way out? And that's where people misunderstand what nirvana means. But the actual on the ground theory is nicely stated by the Buddha. There are 4 basic things that happen: that we suffer, or actually, let me rephrase, things happen to us here on earth that you could say are stressful. No one's exempt from this, right? Because we've all caught, that's
the day-to-day trenches of adult life.
Or as a child, like, right? If you're born, you're gonna have a cold, right?
Pretty miserable.
But you don't, right? But we don't need to get nihilistic right away, because that's
the Matt Booker way right there.
You don't know me very well.
I mean, that's a common way that people go wrong with this Buddhist stuff, is they very quickly. It's the same way Nietzsche kind of ultimately went wrong, but you think like suffering is this very loaded word. The basic principle is like just like shit happens, but it's like a cold. You wouldn't think of getting a cold as like suffering, right?
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it is a stress, right? Yeah. It is something we would prefer not to have, right? And then of course there's the big ones like death, but
terminal.
And then the second truth is that to this suffering we have reactions, right? We react a certain way, and the way we react often causes us a lot of harm. The third one is that it doesn't have to be that way. In other words, the way we react, that's what we have a choice about. It's not that we get not to react, but we can decide with enough wisdom, with enough training, with enough awareness that when I get a cold, I am going to react to it, because you'd be a rock if you didn't, but I don't have to immediately jump off a bridge, right? I can actually think of it as a movement in time or something, right?
Yeah.
And that's the quality, that third noble truth, is that we have a choice and you could become skilled at it. And the fourth one is simply that there's actually a legitimate path. There's things you could do to kind of make your life a little more fulfilling and ultimately free. And so the nutshell, I think is that there's ultimately, I think the philosophy is about how we can gain freedom in this life.
Yeah.
That is plagued with a bunch of hard stuff that happens to us.
Right. And a big part of getting that kind of freedom is through the eradication of certain desires, would you say? Is that...
So that's... Yeah, I'm glad you said it that way.
Cool.
Because it's wrong.
Right, because it's... Yeah.
Just dismantle that.
Yeah. You used a very strong word, eradication. But if you kind of think about it, what fun! I mean, life wouldn't. I mean, that's I think much closer to different religion, different maybe the Abrahamic religions.
Oh yeah, okay.
Judeo-Christian.
That you could conquer the devil, right? The Buddhist thing is not about eradicating, but living with, and actually
managing, taming.
Taming is already too strong.
Okay.
Nurturing, and if you think of the problem isn't that bad stuff happens, and the problem isn't that we have a response to it.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we didn't have a response, we'd be inanimate matter.
Right.
The problem is that our responses, you could think of them as fire. When you have a response that's just as bad as the bad thing that happened, right?
Anger.
So anger used in a way that is unskillful. So Martin Luther King had a lot of anger, but he did good shit with it. But if
you beat your wife, then
you're
causing a new problem.
That's
more
twice
suffering.
as whatever your wife did.
Creating more suffering.
Exactly. So the issue is not about eradication; it's about actually
using it or
meeting it. Acknowledging that this is what I am angry now. But if I have enough awareness, and if I have enough intention to not be, I'd say if I have enough intention to be free, so that I'm not controlled by these more instinctive, reactive.
Yeah.
The defaults.
Negative impulses.
Defaults,
Totally. Yeah, so all this stuff you're saying, Chris, sounds so much like This Is Water, right? Like we're just hearing like shades of that all throughout the Kenyan speech. When at Wallace's funeral, when George Saunders referred to Wallace as a great Buddhist American writer, was that something when you heard him say that, was that something you'd been thinking about a lot already, or did that kind of turn a light bulb for you, or what was kind of the timeline for that comment?
Oh yeah, that's where I put a period in my dissertation.
Nice. Saunders says
proves it. Well, and there's another thing I have to bring up, that at that ceremony I was there, and in the row right in front of me was a Buddhist monk, and that was an issue for a while. And I remember telling Chris this, and he was like, "Who was that?" And I was like, "I don't know." And he was like, we found ourselves in the presence of Karen Green at the ransom center. I was like, "You should ask her."
And I did.
You did ask her, like, who was this Buddhist monk, right?
Yeah.
And unless my memory is completely shot, she did not give me a good answer to that.
I think she just told you it was a family friend.
Were you next to me when I asked?
I was there. I was right there. And,
okay.
And she just said it was a family friend.
Yeah.
But it was very interesting that, Saunders said that, because his whole eulogy was very poignant. And he, the part that stuck with me was not that line. It was at the very beginning where he says he was the first among us. And, Saunders is on the stage with Don DeLillo and Zadie Smith and Franzen. He says Wallace was the first among us, and he thinks he was a great Buddhist writer. So it was a very insightful piece. But then to say that really in the presence of like a Buddhist monk, it really added some weight to the statement.
Yeah.
Like, all right, George, back it up, man. Like.
So then after the fact, I got to say, it was through our email list on Wallace L that there's a guy on there named Christopher Hanaker, who then came out after that, and then 2008, and said, "Oh yeah, I had corresponded with Wallace about meditation." And I was like, "Wow, I didn't know about this." And there was a lot of things that came out after his death that we didn't know while he was writing and publishing, that he was actively sort of seeking out this guidance about meditation.
Yeah, and so then I corresponded with Christopher via email and then in letter.
Yeah.
I mean, in writing. And so I had access. Christopher very kindly sent me photocopies of all their correspondence having to do with their meditation questions that Wallace had.
Nice.
So a dissertation, like the one I wrote, it's not about, we were laughing at it earlier, it's not about proving the point, but it was very convenient that the suspicion I had actually ended up being biographically sound.
Yeah. That's
I mean, even if it wasn't, it wouldn't have mattered because we still have the art. But you know, I mean, by the time Pale King, I mean, some of that stuff is so explicit that it'd be odd for that to not have been the case.
Well, and you make an interesting point in there about the Pale King is like, you're saying, well, it's not explicitly a Buddhist text, but what would such a thing even look like? Like what would it even look like if he was like, and now I'm going to write about Buddhism? Like, and that's even like, that's not even a Buddhist thing to say. Right. Like, it's not even... it doesn't even fit with the philosophy to be explicit about it.
The form and content do not match.
It's like better to even approach through these parables or through these stories or through these examples. But the boredom thing, I mean, we got to talk about that because to me that was...
Am I such a bad guest?
No.
Yeah, speaking of boredom,
you're killing me. No. The Pale King version of boredom. Because... I immediately thought there was something religious even about attacking that idea. And that, to me, something that's boring or full of boredom has no meaning. If you're doing a rote task and it's really boring, that's meaningless. And you can sort of zone out and forget about it. But then for someone to tell you, oh, there's meaning not in doing the task itself, but being in that state, to me that was... that was like the most explicitly Buddhist thing he had written. And the fact that he didn't get to publish it in his lifetime, I mean, kind of means he didn't get to grapple with that publicly, right? It was posthumous, rather, you know, we're sort of grappling it with him not being here to defend himself against this, of me saying like, oh, you wrote this great Buddhist novel, but to me, I had never seen it approached that way, at least by another American fiction writer.
So there's a real catch with the Buddhist stuff, which is that it's not it can't be merely intellectual, and that's a tremendously difficult thing to really accept and understand. That you could read 1 billion Buddhist tomes, you could be a Buddhist scholar, you can know all these theories, but your cells, your cellular neurology pathways do not get changed by reading books.
Right, yeah.
They get changed by physical activity. This is, by the way, the Zen Buddhist in me speaking. Other forms of Buddhism don't place as much weight on meditation as what I'm familiar with. Yeah. But the act of meditation is a physical, it's actually a yoga posture. Your body actually hurts.
Yeah.
And to your point, Matt, when you meditate the way I've been trained and the way I imagine Wallace was starting to dabble in because he was talking to Christopher, who's also Zen Buddhist,
right.
You are asked to sit in front of a wall that is blank and keep your eyes open for usually about half an hour. So once you get over the fact that there aren't gigantic fire ants crawling over you, right? Then if you actually think what's happening in that situation is you're looking at something that's inanimate, and yet the most fascinating things show up.
Seems very
I mean, you'll have people, especially people that do long Zen retreats, you have unicorns starting to show up and you know, that wall all of a
tapestry
sudden, of all kinds of things. But that's all of which is to say that boredom is doesn't really exist. It's our projection onto a certain. It's our worldview, right? That creates whatever we want to see.
Interesting.
And I'm very interested in this idea that there's multiple forms of meditation too, and that there are states that you can get into. Wallace seems very focused on that with tennis, with other things where you get into this sort of state of flow where you sort of forget your body. And it's almost like an active form of meditation where you're doing something active. And you know, you read these stories of monks who are gardening or, you know, brewing beer or doing something that's very repetitive, but yet they're silent. And that their minds are somewhere else than what they're, even if they're not sitting in front of a wall, they're being in that state mentally. And I think Wallace, you know, clearly we know he was interested in that sort of flow state. And the tax examiners get into that, and you think, how can that even be anything but excruciating pain?
Right.
And that's what you think about, like sitting. Like, how can that not be extremely painful all day?
Wiggling all day
at a retreat.
Yeah. I want to say two things about that. I want to say there's a positive way of thinking of it, and and one that's slightly, I think, misunderstands the enterprise. So from the way I see it, which is also very limited and mostly limited to, for the most part, one tradition, which is Zen, and that's way different from what the Tibetans do, and it's different from what the Theravadins do in Southeast Asia and so forth. But my negative reply, and I think where Wallace was still, this spoke to me that he wasn't quite an experienced meditator, is because that's a kind of cartoonish version of what meditation is. I mean, he mocks himself by having Drinian flow
levitating,
up, right?
wild
levitating.
kind of.
But that, I think that still there is a notion that when you do that stuff, you're escaping and you're transcending. All of Buddha's teachings really were, there is no transcending, he refused to answer metaphysical questions. He was a deep, deep pragmatist. Like, life is hard, how do we live fully in spite of that, right? And not escape from it. In other words, it's almost the opposite of heaven and hell. It's like, right here is what we have. So the whole levitation and transcending into higher states is a kind of, I would say, it's a little closer to a pop culture version of meditation, roughly. But that said, their flip side, the positive way of thinking about it, is that flow state, which isn't, I wouldn't think of it as transcending or like being otherworldly. It would be that you're doing something so thoroughly, right? That in Suzuki Roshi's words, the whole point of Zen Buddhism is to do something so thoroughly that you burn yourself to ash, that you don't leave any trace left over outside yourself, which in this case is usually thoughts about, did I do a good job? What could I have done better, right? If you do something thoroughly, burn yourself down, that is that kind of, I think, meditation as flow that is not otherworldly, that Wallace tapped into also when he wasn't doing the pop culture thing.
And my I have a couple of ideas on that, because one, I think Wallace really achieved that personally through writing. And for him, he says that several times, that's what he loved about writing, is that he could forget about himself and just do it for hours. And that there's also a quote that I love from Gary Snyder, and I'm going to butcher it, but he says something like, the only transcendence you find at the top of the mountain is that which you bring up there with you. And there's a lot of that too, in that this cartoonish idea. There's several like Woody Allen movies about like a guy who is looking for enlightenment, and he tries all these different religions. Like, I'll try meditating, and I'll try Catholicism, and I'm going to try this. And it's like, oh, the revelation is it was within me the whole time to begin with. And this is, Wallace sort of parodies that a little bit in Good Old Neon, and even with Fogel, and like there are other characters that they try certain things to get enlightenment, but it's a joke, right? Because you're not going to find enlightenment in some other place but beyond your own ideas.
And that's brilliant, Matt.
No, I'll take that from a Zen Buddhist master.
And also, it actually points you to the next step that I think is another sort of pop corrective to. I like offering pop culture correctives to what Zen is, because it's been so
misrepresented
so I guess my little role in this world is to try to
correct, right some wrongs,
or offer an alternative way of seeing it.
It's very polite.
And it's not that enlightenment. So that's as materialists in our culture, we like to think of owning things, right? Or having things, right? You gain or attain enlightenment is a common phrase. Your quote points that you can't actually get it externally, right? That it's internal. But there's one step after that, which is that enlightenment is not something you could ever gain. either externally or internally.
And yet people seek it constantly.
So that's where they get wrong and caught up. But there is, in fact, such a thing as enlightened action. And this is what you were talking about with that Wallace found in writing. He himself, you could argue from a Zen perspective, never attained enlightenment. But in part because you can't. There is no...
Fair enough.
There is no
I'm
such
done.
thing, right? There is no such
seek
thing.
Pleasure then.
Right? But what you can experience is activity that is so thoroughly itself without any hindrance, right? You're just a natural man in that phrase. Right. As you're doing the thing that you're doing, it just goes.
Right.
And in that state, that is enlightened activity. And so
people would say that's probably also happiness or your life's purpose. Like, to me, that I'm very interested in that with Wallace's work. Like, what is the purpose of life then? Like, what is it that we're really seeking? Is it that enlightenment and transcendence? And, there's a quote in an essay that I have to plug that I love. I brought it up on Twitter this week, and it's called David Foster Wallace and the Velveteen Rabbit. And if you haven't read this essay, it's a fantastic piece of criticism because the Velveteen Rabbit is not real. If you read the story, it knows it's not real, but more than anything, it wants to be like authentic. It wants to be itself.
Yep.
And that's sort of the question that, pervades all of Wallace's work. And there's this question for like, how can I be real? Or how can I be my real self? And in a way, I think that there's never really any salvation. Like, there's never really any transcendence, except for these little flashes where you get things where he says about boredom, where he says, if you find this state, it will wash over you in waves of, the sheerest like joy and happiness.
Yeah, and in Buddhist language, you often hear the phrase "letting go." So it's almost the opposite. Right. You don't attain this state. It's an actually question of the reason you're not yourself is not because you're never not yourself. The universe is always itself, right? Like, it can't help but it's that we have these concepts of who we think we are, and through no fault of our own, really. Like, when we're young babies, our parents dress us in blue or pink, right, depending, and somehow we associate with ourselves, say, as blue or pink. And when you're that young, that stuff becomes hardwired into your circuitry, or your, as Wallace would say, right, your motherboard at birth. And so the whole process. And you could see it exactly in Wallace's writing, in a sense, for how he started with very pyrotechnic, fancy stuff, and how his language moves more and more over time to simpler and simpler constructions and sentences that say what they mean, and dropping some of that Pomo to some extent. I mean, he still uses Pomo stuff interestingly, but that
brings me back to the Velveteen Rabbit, and that I was going to say in there. It quotes a Zadie Smith line, I don't remember from where, but that if there is an answer that he comes back to a lot, it's that about letting go of the self. And that, the escape from solipsism and getting outside of your own head. And if there is a way out, that's the piece of it that he comes back to a lot is how do you escape, narcissism and solipsism and getting outside of your own head. And that's a lot of what This Is Water is about, right? Like, that's his basic core philosophy, which does seem to be in line with what you're saying from Buddhism.
Yeah, though Christopher Hammaker, I thought, had a great critique of This Is Water that I want to acknowledge on this podcast, because he's also a very dedicated Zen student. He caught on to the fact that. So let me just preface this by saying I ended all of my collegiate classes that I taught every single time by reading This Is Water. It didn't matter what class I was teaching. That just like in college, if you take my class, you are going to read Consider the Lobster, and This is Water, and I don't care what I'm teaching.
Right.
So is this the end of every class session or like the end of every term?
at the end of the year.
All right, guys, we got 45 minutes. 15 minutes of it's going to be mirroring the speech every day. You're going to
hear it.
I have a pretty hardcore critique of it myself later.
But the Zen critique is that this goes back to escaping yourself. And remember, the Zen project is not one of escape. It's actually leaning into. You can't escape who you are, but you can, if you have enough courage, I suppose, you could take the most awful things about yourself or things you think are awful and kind of lean into them, turn toward those things as opposed to away. And if you do that, then you realize that you're fine exactly the way you are. And yeah, if these behaviors are causing you trouble, then you could then begin noticing that and start acting differently. But it's always actually leaning into it. And the critique of This is Water is that instead of having pessimistic glasses, Wallace is arguing for a kind of optimistic glasses, right? Maybe the guy in the SUV is driving his child
to the hospital,
right?
Room, yeah.
But so that's rose-colored glasses. But it could be that the guy is in fact just an asshole in an SUV. But you could still see that as, you know,
you can't hate that guy.
That even though that guy is doing something harmful, if you lean into it, you can actually be sympathetic even then, and just notice that that's the current situation. And it doesn't
change it.
Right. It doesn't have to be happy in order to. And that's the trickier thing to understand some of this, because there's a lot of people trying to find their better selves by. I mean, that's why a lot of people go to monasteries, and I mean, it's a kind of escapist route, is denying life as it is. Instead of saying life as it is difficult, what would happen if I truly accepted it, truly understood what that would mean for me, except that I get angry when people cut me off in traffic, right?
And accepting that you might not be able to even control your anger at that. And to doing radical self-love, you know. He has this thing in the Lipsky book about, you know, treating yourself the way you would treat an infant, in this like very caring, loving way. And you know, Zadie Smith has kind of a reductionist way of coming back to this with love as being, you know, like it's sort of like God is love. That does apply to ourselves, and that there's clear evidence, like even in this stuff Wallace wrote, there's a lot of trouble with self-love. And that really he's very hard on himself, and I think we're, as modern people, very hard on ourselves to say we should be responding perfectly in every situation. We should be finding this enlightenment and transcendence, and we should be. And what appeals to me about this Buddhist way is really that you can be an amateur at it and just be like, I don't really know what I'm doing here. I'm really struggling.
Well, not only that, actually, that's the classic Buddhist text. Really, if you're going to read one, that's the one.
Say the name of it.
Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, and that's essentially that if you really want to be a Zen master, the more childlike you can be, and honestly, and he's not exaggerating.
He's not bullshitting.
No, that the more you can truly not know as you live your day-to-day life, the more life will be
that's your true nature,
honestly genuine, and it's that the second half of the quote is, the famous quote is, in the expert's mind the possibilities are few, in the beginner's mind they're endless. And actually I flipped that quote around, but the point is the same
point.
That's interesting, because even in like Judeo-Christian religions, that concept is very present as well, right? That, you know, like from the mouth of babes comes wisdom and truth, and
I don't feel like it's very prominent though. I feel like there is a little bit of it, but I feel like there is, you know, maybe it manifests itself in different ways, and it manifests itself sometimes as in like an anti-intellectualism. But I think one thing you picked up on in your dissertation and really expanded on is Wallace's treatment of Mario in Incandenza.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up.
In Infinite Jest. And to me, that's really the most sort of innocent, naive, like childlike way that is explicitly connected to like enlightenment
and grotesque.
Yeah,
very grotesque.
Yeah. And so that's the great irony.
Yeah,
or not irony, but I think that's what makes it, from my framework, my viewpoint, kind of Buddhist. That he's not wishing to be better. He's completely at ease in his own deformity.
Yeah,
and can just. I mean, there's similar analogs in all. I think world
traditions.
And,
for sure.
Lepers and so forth.
Yeah.
But that's, I think, often where people go wrong in the Buddhist way, is that you want some sort of purity, you want some kind of like holy presence, but in fact it's the opposite. Yeah. If Mario is just, the only question is to what extent is Mario really conscious of his own, to the extent that he's deformed. And I can't quite remember at this point.
He is. I think he's aware that he's different.
Yeah, I get that impression. It's interesting, Chris, that I haven't, for some reason, I never came across your dissertation until Matt recently sent it to me when we were gearing up for this podcast. And I'm currently, writing a whole chapter about Mario as well, from a Christianity, spirituality perspective, and talking about Mario's uniqueness in that spiritual context. And so I just read your table of contents today, and then I just went straight to the Mario chapter, and I just started going through it. And some of the stuff you're saying is just like very similar to what I'm saying, but in a sort of a different context or different tradition. So I'm really excited to give it a full read and bounce some ideas.
Yeah, I'd love to. And I do remember that Mario, there's a lot of parallels with Disgust. That Mario is disgusting. There are a lot of Wallace really goes nuts with this, but
over the top, cartoonish.
Totally.
But I think he was really sincere. The end point is that there's a real sincerity to being yourself, being authentic. And you
say that Mario is like sort of the pinnacle of spirituality in Infinite Jest. He's like the embodiment of spirituality.
Did I say that?
I can't remember the exact.
Well, to me, there's a good parallel there, but with the addicts, right? So that there are these really disgusting people and habits that happen down in the halfway house that make it seem like you would not want to be around them.
Right.
You would not want to live there. And I'm really affected by that idea that the best among us, or the most sincere among us, would have to sort of bring yourself to that level and say, would you go and live in a halfway house and take someone who is basically an unknown, deformed person who is not a college graduate, and are you going to value them? Are you going to care about their story and their life at all? How easy is it to walk away from them? And that's story with Mario and Barry Loach, is that no one would touch him, and that when you see a homeless person, what is your instinct? Is your instinct really to approach them and say, "I'm just going to offer you a good word today"? Man? Like, no, your instinct
little human warmth and kindness.
is to turn away. I mean, it's almost the most pure thing you can do is sort of turn towards this disgust.
Absolutely, turn towards it. The question I have, and that's why I wondered whether I said, David, that I thought Mario was the epitome of spirituality.
Yeah, I have the quote actually. It's on one.
You can't take it back now.
So
I'll read it. It says, without outright claiming with certainty what that force is, it seems like Mario comes closest to being an embodiment of spirituality.
So now I'd like to put an asterisk in the writing is never done, right?
Yeah, exactly. Totally.
And because that, just saying it, just reading that makes me think, because Mario is a kind of idiot. I think a literal, I don't know if we looked up the word idiot literally. I think there is a kind of, and that would make it seem like spirituality is naive. And I don't think, at least from my understanding now, I don't think that what you're hoping to gain is a kind of one way of, Mario can't help but look at things innocently.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's how I understand spirituality. I think it's close to what Matt is, I think, poking at, which is you approach the filthy person on the street knowing better, knowing that they might get you sick.
And that it's uncomfortable and you don't really want to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So...
And that's Wallace, that, he found himself, I think this is why his biography is almost inseparable from his work for me, and that it keeps coming back up because it fits so neatly with this, what he wrote about was his life essentially, and that he grew up in a, suburban white middle class upbringing, and yet finds himself in a Boston halfway house surrounded by some pretty hardcore addicts and thieves who have been sentenced there by the court. And it would be very easy for him to turn away from him and just make fun of him and say, I'm above you guys. I got into Harvard. I don't need to deal with any of you.
Yeah.
But from all accounts, that's not what he did. And that he, did turn a lot of them into material for his writing. But I think that he did it out of a sincerity, a true connection. And I mean, to me, just the fact that it's not like he's the first person to write about disgusting, weird people, but like not even that he was the first one to do it, but it's the one that we're here talking about today because there's something that resonates, throughout all of his work about maybe there is no way out except for this idea of getting away from yourself. Saying it would be easy for me and comfortable for me to just do what pleases myself, or to do what is, the most comforting thing for me is to say, screw everyone else. And that's easy.
In
right?
what
that's
sense,
very
Matt?
Comfortable. Well, and I think that's the big question, right? Like, and maybe it's too reductive to say it comes back to the stuff that he's talking about in This Is Water, or talking about in Love, about just kind of getting off of your default setting of saying, don't look for opportunities for turning away from uncomfortable things. I mean, this is really generic. It's hard to talk about.
I ran into so much trouble writing this thesis because of that bind of inexpressible truths that you have to just experience instead of talk about. And of course, it's doubly as hard when you have to write about the things. Writing itself is a conceptual game, and if what you're trying to do is move through your concepts to see your concepts clearly, then the actual activity of writing can put you right back into the problem, even harder, possibly. You have to have a whole lot of awareness. So, another great irony is that for all of these Zen masters that talk about silence, that talk about just sitting, just being, just accepting things as they are, Zen has thousands and thousands of tomes that were written. Right? So that is a paradox that people need to get comfortable with.
Sure.
There's no way out of it.
Yeah.
And you even alluded to it, Matt, earlier. As Wallace was writing Infinite Jest, he was in the zone. And yet, if you think about the letters he wrote to DeLillo, the anxiety about having written, he was riddled with it. Yeah. And so you could see that he was far from an enlightened person.
Well, and it's a double bind. He's very obsessed with these sort of loops and these binds that you get caught in, where the more that you worry about it, about like, maybe I'm not stressed enough, and it's like, well, no, maybe I'm too stressed, and then you're creating stress by even worrying and even thinking. It's like, well, how do you even stop thinking? Why am I obsessed with stopping thinking? Like any sort of these loops that you can think yourself into a box is very hard to escape. But I want to go back to a little bit on something we were talking about, how some things about Wallace's biography came out after he died, and it sort of reframed the way that we thought, at least for me, it reframed a lot of the way that we thought about his work and depression and addiction and recovery and suicide, and all of these issues really came to the forefront after he died. And there's an episode mentioned in his biography, and you mentioned it too, where in 2001 he went to a kind of like a Buddhist retreat in France with Thich Nhat Hanh. How do you say it?
Yep.
Thich Nhat Hanh, something like that.
Plum Village, I think it was called.
There you go. And he didn't last very long. He stayed for a week or two and then kind of bailed and came home.
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to ask you guys actually about that because I tried to stay, interestingly, I didn't dig very deep about that. And you guys know more about Wallace than I do.
Well, Matt's the keeper of biographical knowledge on Wallace.
No, I don't put that on me.
But I don't. So first of all, I'm pretty sure he was there a very short time, and I don't know if it was as long as you mentioned. I'd be curious to find out how long he actually stayed. I thought it was actually, for some reason, I thought it was actually only a couple of hours. I don't think it was even a day.
He complained about the food, so you got to think he at least had one meal.
So right, and that was in correct me if I'm wrong. That was in a postcard to DeLillo, right?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And so I've been thinking about that a bit, or now I am. He had to have been
interested in it.
Well, but he was, I think, laughing at himself, right? Or, in other words, I'm guessing the food not being good is not the issue, right?
That was not
right?
the actual issue,
right?
Probably fair to say.
The
he could have hacked
Vietnamese
it in a way, or it didn't. It wasn't what he thought it would be.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Yeah.
I wonder because
he never talked about it. So in 2005, what I found interesting is in 2005 he goes to the Lobster Festival, or maybe it's 2004. He goes to the Lobster Festival and says something about how he hates traveling, he hates tourism, and he says something in there too about how he had never really traveled overseas, which we know he had because he had been to France in 2001, but he never talked about that.
Yeah.
And then in 2005 is whenever he starts writing Christopher Hammaker, asking some really basic questions about meditation and sitting. And it's almost like he was starting over, or he had never really got it, or his interest was really surface level until later. I mean, I don't know what your take is on that, but it seems weird to me that there was like two phases.
So I think this is what I mean by the whole Buddhist stuff. It's nice that this takes us right back to what I was saying. Intellectually, Wallace, I think, over the years was developing he was expanding his circuitry. I mean, he was subconsciously thinking about these things. But you could think about these things as much as you want. The moment you step into a monastery where you're asked to sit in silence for a couple of hours, you're going to go fucking nuts.
You can't hack it.
You just can't, because you are so shocked at what your mind does when it's left to itself.
No smoking, no coffee.
None of that. For Wallace, that must have been like actual hell, right? So blame the food.
No Kodiak plugs.
And yet, that doesn't, I don't think that counters what I was saying, that over the years, since he was a young writer, he was slowly like downloading all this info. Physically, his body was not changing. His mind's pathways weren't really changing. Therefore, we could posit he enters the monastery, runs screaming. But then that taste, that little glimpse, he shifts something, and then he actually starts inquiring about the physicality of it, meaning the realness of it. Right? Because he knew that he wasn't going to outthink that's the whole point, right? He wasn't going to think his way out of that one.
Right. Huh.
And then he starts actually meditating or asking questions about meditation. Yeah. And that's the only answer, the one answer I remember Karen giving me is that she remembers him sitting in the bathroom at odd hours of the night.
Meditating.
I think that's that we're trying to.
Yeah. Huh.
And I mean, at that point, that has become a real sincere shift.
Yeah.
Knowing the difference from the intellectual to the actual embodied thing.
The biology of it almost.
And that I just have to add this. When I think about the entire Wallace story, as lucky as we are to have had him, the tragedy for me, from my perspective, the great tragedy is that if not that meditation solves problems, it really doesn't. It just kind of opens you to acceptance, and then you can kind of just be who you are more, and that tends to
more fully human in a way.
Yeah. But that it seemed to me that Wallace was so close to actually, he was now living.
It was late in his life when he really got into it.
Yeah, I mean, as most people do. I mean, when you go to a Zen center, it's mostly older people.
It's not 18-year-olds.
It's not, no. unless it's cultural, right?
Right.
If it's, we have shit for culture. I mean, we have an adolescent culture, right? We celebrate
spring break all the time.
Perpetual childhood.
Yeah. Whereas in different cultures, right, they actually teach 13-year-olds how to sit quietly.
Yeah.
They fall asleep and they whatever, but at least it's getting ingrained in them.
Yeah.
So for me, that's the tragedy that he was already.
Yeah.
He got pretty serious about it, and you could see it in the Pale King.
Yeah.
There was a calmness. There was a real, I think, genuine curiosity about what is this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Still maybe a little bit facile in certain ways,
right?
But sincere.
Yeah. Huh.
And then the tragedy happened. So.
Yeah. Well, that sounds quite a bit like a final thought. Would you say, Chris?
I have no more. Thanks for. I was like, I have no more of those.
No, I think that align. We've been talking a lot about Infinite Jest, and not necessarily the Pale King. And in Infinite Jest, a lot of his obsession is really on addiction and recovery, and that's a different framework that I think. It is very simplistic, but it is also like sort of anti-dogmatic, and that it doesn't really teach a path to salvation per se, right? It has a very specific aim, a very limited aim, and that's why I brought up this sort of Woody Allen character, who's looking for enlightenment. It's like, I'll try, these new religious movements, and I'll try meditating, and I'll try going into some water pie, and I'll go and join this other club, and that's sort of not, life is always more complicated than that, but that does sort of sum up what you were saying with Wallace, and that he late in life gets down to brass tacks, and it's like,
nice
I'm
pun.
going to actually do something here.
And I think the beauty for me,
tax with an X.
Of all this Buddhist stuff is that really at the end, of going back to the nutshell, is you have everything you need. There's nothing missing. That's one of the linchpins. There's nothing missing. You don't need to go to foreign places. All you really have to have is enough courage to actually just sit down for a little bit and let all those crazy voices in your head actually talk to you. You actually have a conversation where you're interested in them rather than trying to stuff them in the closet.
Right. Yeah.
And that is a pretty simple thing to do in theory.
Yeah. Cool. That's awesome that you brought up Christian monasticism, because on the next episode of The Great Concavity, and we've never looked ahead before, Matt, have we? But we're going to be bringing on a Cistercian monk from Austria. Is going to be our guest, Father Edmund Waldstein. So I think back-to-back episodes, these are going to be so fascinating. Hearing these two great traditions converse with each other.
Well, I can't wait for that, fellas.
Yeah, I think it's going to be cool.
And thank you so much for doing these. You guys, I just have to say, you guys are doing such wonderful work and bringing all these wonderful voices, talking about our man. What a treasure trove of delight.
Yeah, it's been amazing what our guests have brought to the table, and just seeing the diversity and the different disciplines and perspectives that people have brought to the table, whether it's art or whether it's scholarship or poetry, whatever. Like, it's just been such a crazy and cool spectrum, and I feel like we're just barely starting to scratch the surface, with the possible directions that we can go with people to talk to. So it's pretty exciting.
We would just be doing this stuff anyways. We might as well record it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So
for sure.
Dave, I'm gonna say, do you have any announcements you want to make about the Infinite Winter project that just finished and wrapped up.
Yeah, I'll say a thing about that. So if you've been following Infinite Winter at all, we had our final chapter post last week, and then this week we had our final thought post. And Mark and I today, Flanagan, were emailing and just talking about how weird it is that we don't have Infinite Jest to read this week and to be thinking about what to write. And similarly, I can't just go on Infinite Winter and see what the latest post is this morning, because it's done. So it feels like this really kind of it's a bit empty feeling that it's over. It was such a fun and rewarding thing to be a part of, and so I just want to thank Mark Flanagan so much for putting it on and for spearheading it, and to all the other guides who have contributed so faithfully every week. It's been awesome to hear Corey and to hear Nathan and
Jenny Baker
and
Ryan Blank.
Speaking of blanks, me just blanking out. I'm so filled with gratitude that I just, I'm blanking out.
I really enjoyed that project because, there's been a lot of those projects, and it's really, they're dependent on how dedicated the participants are to really following it through. Yeah. And really everyone who was involved in that project really just did a bang up job in staying dedicated to the work day in and day out. And that's really hard to do on these projects where, you're not getting paid. Yeah. It's a labor of love. Mm-hmm. And, there's every other excuse you could come up with not to do the reading and not to show up for your homework. Yeah. And you guys all did it for how long did that go on? 5 months?
It was 3 months. So we did, I think we did 15 posts each, which is a fair bit of writing. So it's kind of a fun portfolio to have now and go back through and be like, oh yeah, I remember writing that post, but it feels like it was so long ago that I kind of forgot that I wrote it, So it's been quite a cool project from just thinking about your own thinking kind of a perspective, sort of metacognition. But luckily, if you missed Infinite Winter, or if you miss Infinite Winter and you can't wait to revisit that kind of a group read, something came across our desk just this morning called Poor York's Summer, that is going to be an online community read of Infinite Jest this summer. And it's put on by some other fellow Nuxters. Our friend Phil Miletic, who is out in Ontario, he's doing his dissertation on Wallace and the concept of the community read, I think. And so he is, as part of his dissertation research, putting on a summer read of Infinite Jest. So you can check that out there on Twitter at Poor York's Summer, and the website is poursummer.org. So you can follow along there with that. So that should be cool. We look forward to it. Any shout outs, Matt, to anything else?
Shout out to everyone who has downloaded our latest episodes, and we've really had a ton of good feedback. We appreciate everyone for listening and following along.
Totally.
The response to our show has just been way better than I ever could have imagined, and I love all of our listeners who write in and send us email. We love getting email. If you want to email us, our email address is concavityshow@gmail.com, and you can send us whatever you like or ask us questions. We also you can follow us on Twitter at concavityshow, and it's the same handle on Instagram as well.
You got it. And Chris, for people who want to get in touch with you and see more of your stuff, where can they go for that?
So I'm starting my own podcast called Sunny and Wise. So I think that'll be up and running in a month or two.
Cool.
And the little wisdom academy that I'm starting here in Austin is called thewisdomsmithy.org.
Sweet. Very cool.
And that's where I'm going to try to do things.
Are you on Twitter? Do you have a Twitter?
I had a Twitter.
We'll link to it on the show.
It may have timed out or something.
Right. No. We'll link to it on there. Right. You have had multiple Twitter identities. Chris has got interesting paths in the online space.
Oh yeah.
I won't go into all the details. I was going to ask too, for our website, can you give us a brief reading list for people who want to read more about some of the Buddhist books that you mentioned?
I think the real gold standard, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind.
All right, we'll link to that one.
And that's by Shinryu Suzuki. And then for Wallace, for people that are not interested in this stuff from any religious aspect, there's a fantastic contemporary Buddhist scholar, former monk, Stephen Batchelor. It was one of the first books I encountered called Buddhism Without Beliefs. And so that really strips down all of the extra stuff that people have put onto.
No, I have one of his books. I think it's called Confessions of an Atheist Buddhist.
Yeah, Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist.
Buddhist Atheist, yeah.
And he explains why he left the monastery to rejoin the world. So
it's fantastic, though. Really, really well written.
Absolutely.
Cool.
And I would say the last rec I would have is called The Feeling Buddha by David Brazier. Which is really badass and twists the Four Noble Truths in a way that you don't normally hear about. So.
Cool.
I'll definitely have to check that out.
That's awesome. So this is interesting. We've talked about Brian Moore's book, Catholics, the novel, which kind of imagines a future of Catholicism that is kind of like a mashup with Buddhism in a way, is the way he sort of positions it. So going into next week's guest, that'll be kind of an interesting thing to think about. Yeah. Maybe I'll reread that in the next couple of weeks.
I can't wait for that.
Yeah, it'll be fun. Cool. Well, Chris, thank you so much for coming on, man.
I had a blast, man.
Yeah, you guys are the best.
It's been great talking to you, man. Loved it.
A virtual hug to you, David.
Yeah, you too. We're doing video phony right now, too, which we almost never do.
It's true.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, everybody, for listening. See you next time.